operating procedure. As we just saw with the Panama Papers investigation, outlets that once were chasing the exclusive, the scoop, are now willing or maybe feel compelled to join forces with their competitors and to even keep a lid on juicy stories for months or longer, all in the spirit of collaboration. One organization that really honed the practice of multi-newsroom operations was WikiLeaks, when its founder and editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, decided to partner with a few news outlets on the Afghan war logs. He created a reporting model that would go on to grow larger with more and more partners. Assange has been living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since August of 2012. He sought asylum there when prosecutors in Sweden overseeing a sexual assault investigation were calling for him to be extradited. Assange says that he fears that in Sweden he would then be at risk of being extradited to the US, where he could be tried for espionage. We went to the Ecuadorian embassy in London to sit down with Assange and discuss the Panama Papers, multi-newsroom collaborations, as well as how to handle leaked documents. But we started out by asking him about where this story began, the source, the whistleblower. What kind of person would reveal all those secrets and why?
Assuming they were an insider or they were an individual computer hacker coming from the outside, this is a technical person, or this person had help from a technical person. I think it's likely that this represents radicalization of the technical class. That's something that we've seen, for example, with Snowden. So these usually young men who are technically educated know how to extract material. But of course they have to have the idea. And the idea is given to them by successful examples. And now there have been a range of successful examples.
But it's also to do with hardware, though, isn't it? Because back in 2010, most journalists at most news organizations wouldn't have had a clue about encryption. Back in 2013, when Snowden came out, most Guardian journalists he was dealing with, he had to school on encryption. Now, so many news outlets are providing these boxes, these, for lack of a better term, safe havens for data that 5 years ago only organizations like yours and a few others did. That's a big change as well, isn't it?
Well, I don't believe that Süddeutsche got their material that way. However, their journalists have been educated in the technology. But it's no surprise that it was a German newspaper, because Germany is the center of technical education of journalists, and is also the center of the political radicalization of the technical class. Both of those two things combined.
The head of the ICIJ said that ICIJ, the consortium, has no plans to release the full data set. He said, we're not WikiLeaks, we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly.
Yeah, that's a concern. So we're very pleased about the work that SC, Süddeutsche Zeitung, did in the beginning in developing that source. We think that's really good work. The work of the source, of course, is the most impressive. And then pulling together that collaboration is also impressive work. Saying that you're going to censor and not release a lot of the material, in fact, what must be 99% of the material, that's a big problem. It's fine to have some kind of staggered release because you want to balance the supply and demand curve. But what I want to hear is that there is a path, a transparent path to publishing the vast majority of that data set, because that's what's interesting from a legal perspective, from a historical perspective. One of the fundamental missed lessons of the WikiLeaks experience is about how to deal with scale. Okay, one part of dealing with scale is stitch together a big international collaboration, get more bodies, more eyeballs on the material. The other way to deal with scale is that scale is inherent in the material. When you've got millions of documents, you need to make millions of documents available, citable. So it's not just a few hundred journalists, it's all the lawyers in the world. It's all the police in the world.
As someone who pretty much wrote the book on multimedia outlet collaborations, you knew that this stuff was coming. When you saw the first wave, the first 2-3 days of reporting, what stood out for you, and what did you not see that you thought you would in the reporting?
Well, we've been covering offshore sector for a long time, since 2007. In fact, WikiLeaks has used the offshore sector for protection from banking blockades, so we even had to research it for our own purposes. But in terms of the initial angling of the story, that can be a bit strange. There was clearly a conscious effort to go with the Putin bashing, North Korea bashing, sanctions bashing, etc. But for some reason, some papers, like The Guardian, thought that that was necessary.
Have we seen any other examples in the parochial reporting, media outlets from various countries doing what The Guardian appears to have done, which is point at a distant target while not paying as much attention, proportionally speaking, to a domestic target much closer to home?
Sure, that was done in Sweden with SVT, the Swedish state TV, beating up on Iceland. Iceland's a small Scandinavian neighbour, sort of viewed as quite provincial and fun to beat up on. But the Swedish trusts were not really examined.
Am I the only one who's surprised that more than 100 news organizations can get involved with a story like this, and somehow in an industry that is famous for rumor mongering and incurable gossips, they managed to keep a lid on the whole story until it came out?
I think it is interesting. We knew, we know other people in other news organizations who knew, but who didn't say anything, I think because no one knows of the law firm concerned. It doesn't have name recognition. Then the individual details are, they're quite technical. You can't tweet this story. You can't spill the beans with just a small comment. So I think there just wasn't the market to do it. Could also be that so many news organizations were involved, so they had incentives to not report.
The other thing that strikes me about this is that we're sitting in an embassy in London that you are not free to leave. And a lot of politicians, primarily in the United States, but also elsewhere, when the leaks came out in 2010, they turned you into the embodiment of the problem. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of that Napster story, a free musical service that the music industry went after in a big way, destroyed in a court of law, and woke up the next morning and found out that Napster wasn't their problem. The technology was their problem. There is no music industry, per se, compared to what there was before today. And I'm wondering if you feel like that now would be a good time to point out that you weren't necessarily their problem. Their problem is the technology, and you can't lock that up in an embassy in West London.
Look, WikiLeaks set an example, and the example was the threat. And the example was a threat because the technology, over time, became more available to other people who could then follow the example. Looking forward as to how I think the Panama Papers will go, it's going to be very hard to get reform without a bulk publishing effort. There's just not the mass to deal with the reliance that the establishment of the UK, the United States, and in fact most countries have in the offshore sector. Now, what you have in practice at the moment is basically a two-tiered tax system, where the middle class and the working poor pay income tax, and the wealthy essentially don't pay anything. That's a question about the structure of society, and that big picture is not being engaged with in the journalism that is done. It is, oh, North Korea, oh, Russia, oh, sanctions breaking, oh, maybe someone dodging inheritance tax a little bit. But there is a big picture here as well.
Stories that we can put a face on. They like to do the stories that they can put a face on.
You know, scandals and stories you can put a face on can be good for marketing reasons. But what are you marketing in the end? What WikiLeaks does, and what I believe should have been done with this story, is that the scandals are there to market the archive, because it's the archive that has the scale that can deal with the problem. I say that this generation, or that perhaps our generation, but anyway, this generation being born now, in seconds in most countries, very shortly in most countries, and it's already happened in say, China, most European countries, the United States, is the last free generation. You were born, and either immediately or within, say, a year, you're known globally. Your identity in one form or another, coming as a result of your idiotic parents plastering your name and photos over Facebook, or as a result of insurance applications or passport applications, transport, on airlines, etc. You are known to all the world's major powers, all the world's major state powers, and all the world's major commercial powers. That's a very different situation for individuals to be in than they have previously been in. That a small child now, in some sense, has to negotiate its relationship with all the world's major powers. Of course, in practice, it can't do anything. Its parents are not managing that negotiation. But it puts us in I think, a very different position in the sense that very few, in fact, maybe only a few people in this audience, very technically capable people, are able to live apart, to choose to live apart, to choose to go their own way. They must be part of not only the state, but the major state-like corporations, so powerful they may as well be states, and not just their own state, but other states as well. That's a significant change, cultural change for humanity.
These are human beings, Julian, and their lives are at stake.
What about the lives of the soldiers and the civilians involved in these conflicts? Death squads, unreported civilian casualties, countless incidents of friendly fire. This is information the world needs to know.
A scene from The Fifth Estate, a new movie tracking the complicated and compelling story of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Assange, who is standing by to join us live, has taken some shots at the film, and he tried to persuade the actor who portrays him, Benedict Cumberbatch, to refuse the role. ABC's Lindsay Davis sat down with the actor to talk about that challenge and why he chose to accept the part.
Until now, British actor Benedict Cumberbatch has been most commonly recognized for his role in the BBC's critically acclaimed series Sherlock. And most recently is Captain Kirk's nemesis in Star Trek Into Darkness.
Why did you allow me to live? And action.
Quite a departure from his starring role in the new film The Fifth Estate as WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, the man who's been called the world's most notorious transparency activist.
Attempting to criticize the messenger, to distract from the power
of the message.
Playing Assange is complex enough, but it was further complicated by the fact that the famed whistleblower was opposed to the movie.
The difficulty, I guess, was to try and portray him as a three-dimensional human being, not vilify him or glorify him.
So you reach out to him, trying to get a fix on his character, and how does Assange respond?
Well, he slammed the door pretty politely, but pretty firmly.
The door, he describes, was an eloquently crafted email written by Assange to Cumberbatch in which he says, "I believe you're a good person, but I do not believe that this film is a good film. It is going to smother the truthful version of events at a time when the truth is most in demand. By meeting with you, I would validate this wretched film and endorse the talented but debauched performance that the script will force you to give."
And I wrote one back with equal force, arguing why I thought this story and his character, and at this particular moment in time, was needed. WikiLeaks achieved great things all the way up to the 2010 big splash with the Warlocks and cables. I think the film celebrates that. I think it's far more diversive in its viewpoint and perspective than he feared it would be.
How do you play a man, though, who refuses to meet you?
It's hard. You do have to make leaps of faith. You do have to join dots, and that's where the fictitious element of a dramatization comes about.
You said before that we're all citizens of democracy. How aware are you of the Snowdens and the issues that surround this debate?
Very. I mean, we are living in a time where in order to fight terrorism, we are eroding civil liberties at a rate that's a little alarming, really alarming in fact. And yet at the same time we need to save people's lives. I mean, it's very difficult to be completely clear-cut. I think it needs debate.
And debate is precisely what he believes the Fifth Estate will provoke.
This is information the world needs to know.
For this week, Lindsay Davis, ABC News, New York.
The Fifth Estate is being distributed by Touchstone Pictures, a division of ABC's parent company, Disney. And with that, let's continue the debate. We turn live to Julian Assange, who joins us from the Ecuadorian Embassy in London. Thank you for joining us again, Mr. Assange. And you heard Benedict Cumberbatch there. He says he tried to neither glorify nor vilify you, and the film celebrates many of what he calls the great things that WikiLeaks has done. Do you accept that?
Well, Mr. Cumberbatch wrote me a charming, very polite letter, and with genuine concerns about the nature of the script being used in that film. He's reported to have said to Vogue and to The Guardian that he had fights with a director who wanted to present me as a quote, cartoon baddie. That's Mr. Cumberbatch's words. I don't want to put words into his additional words into his mouth, but of course he is under a contract and is limited to what he can say in the film. I do know that he tried to ameliorate some of the worst elements of the script, but unfortunately with limited success.
What's your biggest complaint?
I'm pleased he tried.
What's your biggest complaint with the film?
Well, I don't know where to begin. I mean, we released the whole script well before this happened. There was no approach to us by DreamWorks in any formal capacity whatsoever, other than the informal approach by Benedict Cumberbatch just days before shooting began. This is a film that is based upon my life's work, the work of my organisation. We have people in extremely serious situations. Sarah Harrison, who accompanied Edward Snowden out of Hong Kong, now effectively in exile in Russia because of the terrorism investigation here. Jeremy Hammond, an alleged media source to 25 organisations, including ours, up for sentencing in under a month's time. An ongoing grand jury investigation. What are the responsibilities for ethical filmmaking in that context? None of the suggested changes that we sent to participant media ended up even in the final text of the film. But there's been a big cashing in that has gone on.
You mentioned Sarah Harrison.
A rich organisation that is. Yeah.
You mentioned Sarah Harrison, as you said.
This is a rich organisation, DreamWorks. It's making a lot of money and is intending to make a lot of money from this process. But there's no contribution to our defence fund, to the defence fund of our alleged sources, and so on.
Let me move on to Sarah Harrison. As you said, she's with Edward Snowden. We saw Edward Snowden this week receive an award from 4 American whistleblowers who traveled over to meet with him, and it was something that was facilitated by WikiLeaks. Of course, Sarah Harrison, a prime member of WikiLeaks as well. She's been with Snowden throughout his time in Russia. What can you tell us about how Edward Snowden is doing right now? What's next for him and for Sarah Harrison?
Edward Snowden is safe. We, through a lot of work, in particularly by Sarah Harrison, managed to gain him asylum in Russia after our attempts to gain him asylum in South America were thwarted in a very bizarre manner by the State Department by cancelling his passport while he was in Moscow. So he's safe. He's working to educate people, the journalists involved in these disclosures as to what is going on. He very rightly received that award from former NSA, CIA, FBI and DOJ whistleblowers, an award for integrity. It's a serious matter. It's a threat to US democracy and to democracy more broadly in the West to have a surveillance apparatus on every single person that would have been the dream of East Germany.
Yet at the same time, those revelations from Edward Snowden came under strong attack this week from the head of Britain's domestic intelligence agency, M15, Andrew Parker, who called the leaks a gift to the terrorists. NSA Chief Keith Alexander said this week that people will die because of the leaks. Your response?
Well, we've seen this for 50 years. Every time the press embarrasses the security establishment, shows that they've been acting unlawfully, acting against what they have said to Congress or to the media, they trot out this old canard that some speculative harm sometime in the future might happen, when we're discussing harm that is happening right now. As a result of these abusive programs. The budget procedure you mentioned just recently, well, interesting side effect of that, the National Security Agency has used the debate in Congress to cancel even its own internal investigation. But the people on the review panel are unremunerated. It's quite interesting to see how Clapper or Obama says, yes, we need to have a debate, we need to have an investigation, everything must be under democratic control. But at the first instance that they can, as soon as there's a distraction, they try and subvert their promises to the public.
And what's next for you, Mr. Assange? Any chance you're going to leave that embassy anytime soon?
Well, I would leave this embassy. You know, it's a bit of a prison in some way, but I have good people here. But where would I go to? You know, I would end up in the outside world, where you are. But what is happening to the outside world? That's a much bigger consideration. It's a bigger consideration for me and my staff and the 12 different legal actions we have going in different countries. But it's a consideration for everyone. What type of place is Western democracy going to be? Is it going to be a place with a collapsing rule of law, with mass surveillance of entire populations, all the practical elements of a totalitarian regime? We don't yet have a totalitarian regime, but we have all getting pretty close in the practical elements. Is that going to cross over into something else? That would be a hard place for an investigative organisation like WikiLeaks to work in. It is a hard place for Glenn Greenwald. He's now in effective exile in Brazil. Laura Poitras in effective exile in Germany. Sarah Harrison, a UK citizen, in effective exile in Russia. Edward Snowden in asylum in Russia. Me, asylum here. The West is becoming a place where the best and the brightest who keep the government, hold the government to account, are ending up in asylum or in exile in other countries. We've seen that before with dictatorships in Latin America, with the Soviet Union, and it's time it stopped.
It's clear your fight is going to continue. Mr. Assange, thanks very much.
There's a early 2014 email.
With me is the founder of WikiLeaks. He's just published When Google Met WikiLeaks. Julian, thanks for inviting us into the Ecuadorian embassy. How did it come about that you could trust Google executives, one of the most powerful companies on earth, coming to meet you while you were under virtual house arrest?
Well, I'm not sure that I trusted them any more than they trusted me, but it was a very interesting meeting between the most senior executive of Google, Eric Schmidt, now the chairman of Google, and myself during the middle of the Arab Spring with a secret meeting, and 3 other people also brought by Google to that meeting.
What did you think they were there for?
Well, nominally they were there in order to write a book on geopolitics and how the world would unfurl, and to conduct an interview with me. And I thought that probably was most of the reason why they're also maybe to speak to Google staff to try and make them look a bit less conservative and to get supportive of their engineers, and to try and get more strategic vision for how they wanted to deploy Google over the world and what were upcoming developments that I might know about that they might not. But it turned out things were rather different.
At that time, before Snowden, before other elements from WikiLeaks, we didn't really know that the Don't Be Evil company was so entwined with elements of the US security state. And I know in this transcript, which makes up this book, it's a point you want to make. Eric Schmidt, his father worked in the Nixon administration, and he'd just written a book called Empire of the Mind, which you had read. Or no? That
well, I hadn't at that stage. He had written an essay together with Jared Cohen immediately. He was then still Hillary's advisor, called Empire of the Mind. And that was right before the Arab Spring. And so as a result, there was a lot of interest in their sort of vision for what all that meant. And they went on to write a subsequent book, which is Google's vision, geopolitical vision for the world.
And that got endorsements as well from Tony Blair and Henry Kissinger?
They got endorsements from Tony Blair, Henry Kissinger, Madeleine Albright, a cast of warmongers or actual war criminals, pre-publication, all set up pre-publication. And Henry Kissinger is in fact one of the central people in that book. But you know, it's fine for people to write books. The question to me became, why was that book written? It's a very, very strange book. And
you actually met Jared Cohen. He was one of the people that came to meet you, and This is a man, and we must say that this interview is being conducted just days after the US Congress has authorized military aid to so-called moderate Islamists in Syria. There are airstrikes in Iraq. Tell me about this Jared Cohen.
So Jared Cohen was the previous advisor for Hillary. He jumped from Hillary to work to being the head of Google Ideas. And Google Ideas is an in-house State Department that Google runs. Its functions are essentially the same as the US State Department, to make alliances with various people, to bring together activists and security generals and so on, bring them together under Google ambit and create various forms of networking, and even in some cases actively intervene with different governments to try and destabilize them.
Now, I've read the book and listened to the audio recording. It's quite friendly. But in Empire of the Mind, there are clear sentences in here, things like greater transparency in all things is a dangerous model.
Yeah, the position being pushed forward by Google at its most senior executive level to Washington is that it is the state who should determine what is published and what is not published. There should be a state body that oversees whistleblowing organizations, and they have to go through that state body before they can release material.
And it's not just Jared Cohen. Jared Cohen's past and provenance. He used to work with a woman called Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's been in a lot of TV studios in America, head of the New American Foundation, and she's saying Britain usually involved as well, in covert funding in Ukraine.
That's right. Anne-Marie Slaughter, there's quite a very interesting network. Let me pull back a bit, because it'll get quite confusing if we go into all the details. But Google, at that executive level, has a revolving door with the State Department, and it is trying to become America's geopolitical visionary, because it is a company that is enmeshed into the world, into every single country, billions of people using Google services, Google collecting all that information from all those people, their emails, their geographic locations if they use Android-powered phones, and so on. And then the National Security Agency piggybacking on the top of Google and pulling information out of Google. So Google has a lot of room to argue that it is the edge of the way the world is developing economically and in terms of information and in terms of geopolitics, because it has to deal with all these countries. So the Empire of the Mind and the subsequent Google book is a calling to Washington, not to the general public, because it's not really a book that's readable by the general public, but a calling to Washington. And that's why those figures such as Henry Kissinger and Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright are there giving pre-publication endorsements. That's my interpretation.
When you say 6 billion retinas see that Google homepage every day, they were advertising a John Kerry speech when America and of course Britain wanted, the governments wanted to get their people to endorse the bombing of Damascus.
Right, so Google has a lot of advertising power. Its homepage, the most people see that per day more than anything else. Billions of people see various Google pages, whether they're from YouTube or the main search page or on the Android phone. So that gives Google intense ability not only to collect information about what people are doing, but also to project what it wants to those people. There has been a perception previously that people just pay for ads and then Google displays those ads, and it doesn't actively intervene in terms of its ability to influence. That is not true. In fact, during the most intense moment of the debate in US Congress, whether Syria was to be bombed or not bombed, Google, on its homepage, put up a link in red, highlighted, to point directly to the Kerry speech.
Well, I mean, that's one shocking piece of information. You did a couple of mainstream interviews about this book. Google very quick to say, and perhaps uphold their countercultural public relations image and say, at no point do we have this connection, and we certainly don't give all the data you just said to the National Security Agency.
The statement is written, it seems, by lawyers, and you have to be careful. They didn't actually say that. What they said is they don't give direct access to their servers to the National Security Agency. But that's not how the prison system works. How the prison system works is Google maintains a server, and the FBI is involved at a sort of formal level in maintaining those interception servers, and then the National Security Agency is able to access those. So it's, but in practice, as we've seen, it's well documented in the Snowden documents. The National Security Agency can search most of Google's data for what it wants and does.
How do you think Britain fits in with these sorts of policies and how Google works? Are there top-level connections between Google and our government?
Well, there's been reportage from the Snowden material that that Google's internal network has also been mass intercepted by the National Security Agency. So a number of things are going on here. You have Google as an institution. It is now the second largest company by market capitalization, $400 billion in the US, and it's growing ever faster and penetrating other countries. Even countries like China, which are perceived to be more or less free from Google because they've excluded Google really from the search market there, and they have Baidu. But all these smartphones mean that Google, in fact, is pulling lots of data out of China. Then you have Google's relationship, which is, I document in the book, with the National Security Agency and the defense sector in the US. And that goes way back, in fact, to the very first paper that initiated Google was funded in part by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Since 2002, Google has been involved in formal contracts with the National Security Agency of the United States. And then there is the National Security Agency intercepting Google's internal communications and communications that go to Google. So what we have here is a mixture of voluntary interaction at a sort of contract official level, social interaction at the level of senior executives of Google, and then we have coerced interaction, where just the fact that Google is collecting all this material, and that is part of its business model, to collect as much information about people and how they behave, to generate profiles of them, to make them as predictable as possible for advertising, that can then be intercepted. Even if the voluntary aspect of Google withdraws, even if the social aspect in terms of the network that Eric Schmidt is embedded in withdraws, or the in-house mini State Department they have, Google Ideas, withdraws. The very fact that Google's business model is to collect as much information about people as possible, to make them as predictable as possible, means that the National Security Agency is just going to piggyback on top of that.
So what about all the breathless news we get about Google Glass? We shouldn't be it shouldn't be seen as so benign.
Well, I mean, Google Glass is possibly a realization of some Orwellian horror, in the sense that this places Google between your eyes and the world. So not only is Google collecting your email if you use Gmail, if you use Android phone, not only is it collecting what you're thinking about when you're searching, your location information if you use Android phone, what interests you have on YouTube and so on, but we're able to collect directly the images that you are pulling through.
I use an Android phone. How much?
Well, 80% of phones now sold that are smartphones are Android, 80%, and that figure is increasing.
So I do want you to mention the Dr. Strangelove moment when you're trying to get hold of Hillary Clinton, widely seen as the next Democratic presidential contender.
All right, so what happens? Eric Schmidt, these Google senior executives come to see me, Eric Schmidt and 3 other people. I don't think too much about the 3 other people at the time, and we have this interesting conversation, which is documented in the book. And then a little bit later, I need to speak to the most senior person in the State Department. Hillary is the most senior person. And so we try to arrange that call, and for people who are maybe not familiar with these things, if you get your PA to try and arrange something with someone else's PA in some big departments, actually you can get up pretty high pretty quick. And there was this Dr. Strangelove moment where the State Department is saying, who wants to talk to Hillary, Julian Assange? Come on, is it really Julian Assange? How can we prove that it's Julian? How can you prove it's Julian Assange, etc., etc.? And so we start progressing up the levels, and then we get a statement that there'll be a callback, which is not unsurprising, to check, etc. And we do get communications back, but we get them through a back channel. One of my other staff members who had arranged the Schmidt visit, the visit by Google, he got the call. And he got the call.
Even though you called the State Department, not
He got
Google.
the call from Eric Schmidt's then girlfriend, Lisa Shields, who doesn't work nominally for the State Department. She's the Chief of Communications of the Council for Foreign Relations. So the call came in, Julian wants to talk to Hillary. Okay, well, we need to make a back channel in the State Department. Who do we know that oh, that's right. Lisa Shields was just out there because we were told all about it. So get Lisa to be the back channel. So there we have a circumstance where the senior executive of Google was literally in bed with the State Department.
But Julian, ever the publisher, even with a tag around your ankle, you ask Eric Schmidt, one of the most powerful corporation leaders in the world, whether he'll leak something to WikiLeaks.
That's right. We asked that Eric Schmidt provide us with the secret Patriot Act requests that had been served on Google to coerce Google to give information to the US intelligence.
How did you even know that they existed? Because this is before Snowden.
That's right. But I have been studying the National Security Agency for about 20 years, so we knew that this sort of thing was going on even before the Snowden revelations. The Snowden revelations are very important because they gave more detail. Anyway, so he became very nervous and said that he couldn't do that because that would be illegal. But I didn't realize at the time that the amount of, I thought the Google would be acting because it had been coerced rather than there was an element of voluntarism in its associations with the US military.
He's since written complaining to the US government, isn't it? Google's issue is no, they shouldn't be doing it. Google's fighting against the National Security Agency.
Initially when the Snowden thing broke, they were playing it down. And then Google, Facebook came out with an almost identical statement, clearly been worked on together, with this direct access line, trying to spin what had been occurring. And then more Snowden documents were released, documenting more concretely. And then there appears to be perhaps some pressure from within Google, from its lower level engineers who were a bit shocked to find out what was happening. And so Google has taken a more assertive approach in public subsequently. But ultimately, Google is part of the defense industrial base. That's said by the head of the NSA in an email to Eric Schmidt. It has very close associations with US foreign policy circles, and that's going to continue. And even if we got to the stage where Google, as an organization, rejected that notion that it should cooperate in some manner with what is going on, it can simply be coerced to do so.
You say in the book that when it comes to WikiLeaks itself, the opponents of WikiLeaks opportunistically, they distract attention from the actual revelations, and this has been recurring in lots of WikiLeaks revelations. It's always the possibility of harm, and then they kind of forget about the revelations. Just tell me a little bit about that.
Look, that's something that national security journalism has been facing since at least the 1950s, possibly even before.
These are innocent, fair journalists, or they say this they are when they write pieces saying you're dangerous.
Well, I mean, there's you have to understand that when one publication publishes a dynamite story, other publications don't have a story. And so they try and undermine the story in some way. They have to write something, so they will often do that. And then, unfortunately, a lot a lot of those people are too close to the very powers that they should be trying to hold to account. If we go back and look at what the US military, Robert Gates and General McMullen, said about our publications of creating hypotheticals that maybe they would cause harm, our publications documented their involvement at a case-by-case level in the deaths of more than 20,000 people in Afghanistan and more than 108,000 people in Iraq. Those are the stakes that we were talking about. Not only the dissolution of two societies, but the deaths of over 100,000 people. And so when you want to distract from this, you just make the same accusation to the person that is making accusation against you. It's a kindergarten rhetoric. Your mother smells. No, your mother smells. I mean, it's really that pathetic.
I mean, often it's been the most, in inverted commas, liberal journals and magazines that seem to attack you the most. You do say something that I hadn't realized before about the Guardian newspaper.
We should make clear, just to put down on record, in 2013, in the trial of Chelsea Manning, who was subsequently sentenced to 35 years for giving information to the media, and only for giving information to the media. There's no other allegation against them. That the General Carr, the person responsible for investigating whether any harm was caused by our publication, the US government said under oath that they couldn't find a single person who had been harmed. Not a single person.
And yet, as I said, liberal publications from time to time, I mean, the big debate seems to be, and they have these think tank debates going, oh, the real debate is, how much should WikiLeaks have released and what isn't and what is. You do say that the Guardian printed a decrypted password to all the cables.
That's right.
Tell us about why. Was it a mistake by the Guardian?
I think it was probably a mistake, but it's a mistake that comes in a certain context, which is a context to rush. Basically, the Guardian was very concerned about what it had done and whether it would be aggressively criticised for what it had done in relation to us. So it had broken a contract, all 3 points of our contract, and there was a reputational fight on between us and the Guardian. And in that concept, it rushed to put out a book. And in that book, it put the decryption password for all the cables.
That seems so bizarre.
Well, it's just completely incompetent and negligent. And of course, they are perhaps happy to do it because they didn't mind perhaps making problems for us. Elsewhere, they did things that were much more serious. For example, they secretly gave all 251,000 cables to a Mossad contact in Haaretz. All 251,000. And that was the only country, other than the New York Times, that was the only country that they gave all 251,000.
Why would they have done that? We don't know. I mean, of course, at this sort of time, when there was this fight on with the Guardian, there was a film that came out, We Steal Secrets. I think people go through. Just tell us a little bit about how that gave a totally false account, really, of who you are, what WikiLeaks was. I mean,
there was a documentary funded by Universal, about $2 to $3 million in the US, and it was what is typically done in a sort of liberal sphere, which is you build them up and you knock them down, and so they took that trajectory. But we had seen that the filmmaker probably wasn't a trustworthy person, so we didn't want to be engaged in it, so we didn't give them any interviews, and that it's not very interesting. But they then went and became close to the Guardian. So in relation to that dispute about the Guardian's incompetence in putting the password in its book, they took the Guardian's.
It all just jumbled up together. Arguably not as incompetent, all this stuff, as one event you relate in here about the Ministry of Defence here in Britain's reaction to WikiLeaks when it first started the Cablegate, telling British Telecom to...
Oh yeah.
What's that about?
That was quite funny.
I mean, someone at the MOD saw what you were releasing.
So we released a number of classified documents from the British Ministry, and it's very interesting materials, including a 2,000-page document on how to stop leaks and how the number one enemy of the British MOD was not Russian spies, but was in fact investigative journalists. And okay, so then afterwards, as part of our due diligence to protect our sources, we filed the Freedom of Information Act request on the British Ministry of Defence to see if we could get a feeling whether there was any investigation going on and where it was leading. And we got materials out, and those materials showed that the British Ministry of Defence was sort of panicked that this material was there, and they're going, my God, there's pages and pages. In fact, there's hundreds of links, and they had 5 exclamation marks in a row. And then we've got to do something. And they're like, well, okay, let's tell British Telecom, who controls the internet for the Ministry of Defence, that to prevent anyone in the Ministry of Defence reading WikiLeaks. So the counterintelligence guys there neatly solved their problem, and their problem was that their bosses could read WikiLeaks and see Ministry of Defence material there. So they just censored WikiLeaks from their bosses, and as a result, the Ministry, it was great because we were still publishing material from the Ministry of Defence, but the heads of the Ministry of Defence couldn't see it. So
ultimate
just
organizational systems design disaster. Of course, it does get very serious. I mean, it's almost an aside here in this book. I'm not even sure whether we can mention the intelligence security company, which you discovered was tendering for millions of dollars a month to target people associated with you and WikiLeaks.
That's HB Gary.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We'll probably bleep that out. But
well, I think the company's wound up now because I think it's gone now, that company, as a result. The CEO resigned and so on.
But there's seriously tenders of this kind going against publications that are whistleblowing.
Tenders, in that case, for $2 million per month. $2 million per month, paid for by the Bank of America to attack us, attack Glenn Greenwald as a supporter, the Snowden journalist. And the recommendation for those private intelligence companies to the Bank of America was given by the Department of Justice.
Well, despite all of this, here you are in the Ecuadorian embassy. Chelsea Manning, as you said, decades prison sentence, the appeal coming up. You've still come out, WikiLeaks has still come out with the FinFisher leaks, which are part of formerly part of a UK Gamma group. Just tell us just a little bit about the FinFisher malware that you released to the public in the past few days.
Put it in context, 80% of the National Security Agency is run by private industry. So when you think about what is the core of government, what is more government than anything else, you think it must be the intelligence agencies. No, in fact, in the West, the intelligence agencies are now 80% run by private industry, and so a number of different private industries have started up to sell products to intelligence agencies around the world, and one of them is Gamma Group, and Gamma Group produces something called FinFisher, and FinFisher is actually a suite of cyber weapons to hijack people's mobile phones, to turn on the microphone on people's mobile phones, to pull information out of their computers and so on. And probably the most serious thing that it produces is a bulk Trojan system that you put in the major gateway of a country or ISP, and then everyone's connecting to that. The Trojan goes back down and infects their machines. And the material that we published was the code itself to do that. Their command and control center, the actual infection code, and then interactions with their clients, their various intelligence agencies saying, oh, but this thing doesn't work for me on a BlackBerry version 2, etc. And so you get not only a list of clients and how much money that they've spent on this software, but some of the interaction with how they are engaged in targeting individuals and groups.
And so populations in countries which...
for example, in Bahrain, targeting
an ally
human
of
rights.
An ally
of Great Britain, yeah. And with the Fifth Fleet also based in...
Could be used against them. Let's go to the normal politics of it as well. You mentioned in the book at one point that there were once authentic actors like unions and churches, and how it's all been hijacked in a sense. You were depicted as free market statism.
Yes.
In this larger battle, How can what WikiLeaks does contribute in this battle of globalization, really? You mentioned politics versus wealth transfer.
Yeah, well, we're in a position now that, you know, that there's no other game in town other than the internet. It's not a matter of, you know, we can't go back to the caves. If we do that, we cut ourselves off to influence the development of society. But what is happening now is a sort of these fluid, postmodern, public-private networks of interaction. I gave you an example. This National Security Agency, 80% being run by private corporations. And those private corporations, though, have shareholdings across jurisdictions. But the political actors that you might perceive to be working in the other direction, the NGOs, these meetings like the Internet Governance Forum or Sweden's Stockholm Internet Forum, is coming together to what it seems to create a new vision for a better world. These are funded by the same players. So Google and Google Ideas is funding a bunch of these, and they're captive and largely related to its interests. But similarly, the State Department and USAID and SIDA in Sweden and the FCO are also...
Bono's One Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the New America Foundation, you go on. There is hope, though, in this book. I detected the political education of apolitical tech people being extraordinary. And as you said, I think before, that even at the height of the propaganda against WikiLeaks, 40% of the US population, with 900,000 people in America having security clearance.
We have an update on that statistic now. The ACLU, in fact, ran a survey. So that we have majority support, even in the United States, for people under the age of 40. Majority support. So despite the media propaganda, there's still majority support. So people can feel when the media is trying to push them. It's still media propaganda.
Maybe not in Scotland.
Well, but I mean, look, in Scotland, there was 45% support of independence. That was up 15% compared to compared to a year ago when the campaign started. So, okay, they pulled out all stops. You saw the Swedish Foreign Minister trying to intervene in that campaign against Scottish independence, and both Clintons came out against it, and Barack Obama came out against it. The Australian Prime Minister. I mean, Australia, this is a nation that got independence from the United Kingdom 100 years ago, and it's going there trying to deny the Scots.
First to want to bomb Iraq again too, I think. But this security clearance issue, I suppose the most terrifying statistic in your book as regards the authorities. Are you implying, therefore, that with hundreds of thousands of people who have the kind of security clearance that Edward Snowden has?
There are now 6 million people in the United States with security clearances. 6 million. That is more than the population of Norway or New Zealand or Scotland. That is, in effect, a state within a state. Why is it a state within a state? Because people who have security clearances have extra laws that they're meant to obey, and the flow of information about how the state works, what rules and regulations and so on that exist within that state is kept within that state because they're classified. That's an extremely alarming phenomenon.
But all it takes is one of them to write to you.
If we go back to 2010, so just back to 2000, there was 2.5 million. So there's been more than a doubling of the size of the national security state within the US in just 4 or 5 years.
But as a publisher, it's good news for you.
It's good news for us in the sense that, yeah, the more people, I mean, if you think about it, 6 million people having security clearances, more than 1.5 million having top secret security
clearances.
Must
doubt, just one of them must doubt about US foreign policy at the moment.
Exactly.
Julian Assange, thank you.
You're welcome, Afshan.
Well, the New York Times describes my next guest as a new kind of human and an international man of intrigue. In 2010, the Italian edition of Rolling Stone magazine named him Rock Star of the Year, calling him the exterminator of secrets and the pop leader of the end of diplomacy and imperial security. That's the year his organization WikiLeaks made history when it released thousands of classified documents into the public domain, along with footage of the American military firing on unarmed Iraqi civilians. Meanwhile, his critics accuse him of endangering people's lives and being a publicity seeker. Now, 4 years after WikiLeaks became a household name, Julian Assange is a wanted man. He's holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 2 years, with Sweden calling for his extradition over sexual assault allegations, which he denies. But this hasn't stopped Julian Assange from speaking his mind, this time in the form of a new book called When Google Met WikiLeaks. And today, Julian Assange joins me on the line from the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Hello, Julian.
G'day, good to be with you, Q.
Thank you. Well, thank you for calling me Q. I'm Gian, but you can also call me the name of the show. I appreciate it. I do appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know you don't do a lot of interviews. Let me start with this book. And Julian, I understand you wrote this book partly in response to Google Chairman Eric Schmidt's book, The New Digital Age. You agreed to be interviewed for that book, as you describe in this new book of yours, but then you were not happy with how you and WikiLeaks were portrayed. Can you tell us why?
This book by the chairman of Google, Eric Schmidt, is a very important book. It presents Google's geopolitical vision of the world and where it wants to take the world. And in trying to understand why that book was written and what it meant, I looked at what its positioning was and what Google's positioning was, and my conclusion is that Google is striving to be the geopolitical visionary of the United States, the one company that can answer the question, where should America go next in terms of its interactions with the world? And Google's argument for that is that it can see further, that it is on the edge of developments, it has a presence in every place in the world other than North Korea, and that it is used by billions of people and collects the information of billions of people. And given Google's financial power, it is now the second largest corporation in the US. Its geographic human reach, it interacts with more people than any other organization on the planet. There is, of course, a personal story, how I personally became interested in what Google was doing as an organization. As a publisher, I've always, most of the time, focused on governments and for corporations, mainly banks. But Google became something of interest after Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, came to see me in 2011 while I was under house arrest at a secret meeting.
Yeah, I mean, you to a certain extent, well, I was going to say you intimate, but you pretty much overtly state that he kind of pulled one over on you, or you agreed to do this interview for reasons that you soon found or decided were not entirely what was presented to you?
It's hard to say ultimately, but what we do know is that the information collected as a result of the interview very quickly, some parts of it went to the U.S. State Department, to the top of the U.S. State Department, to the degree that when we called up the U.S. State Department on another matter that had to do with our ongoing cable publications, the U.S. State Department looked to authenticate that it was really WikiLeaks and it was really me who was calling and wanting to speak to Hillary. And so they used Eric Schmidt's then girlfriend, who had come out to see me with this Google visit. They used her as the secret back channel for that communication. She doesn't formally work for the U.S. State Department. She has no formal role in being the back channel for the U.S. State Department. But of course, within the State Department, they had known about this visit. So this got me very interested in how was it that the chairman of Google was literally in bed, in a way, with the U.S. State Department.
I want to get to how this is all, what the implications of this have been for you personally, but 2 steps back, when you talk about Google, at one point in the book you say, we all want to believe that Google is benign, that it isn't a player in any sort of nefarious way, but then you allege that Google, and I'm quoting you, heralds the death of privacy and shifts the world towards authoritarianism. So if you were to put it in a nutshell, what worries you most about the growth of Google and its aggressive sort of mission to become a dominating force online, as you put it?
I think Google started out in a different place. Google was an expression of the Berkeley, Stanford graduate student culture, and you can see that in its sort of early internal self-reflection and the way it wanted to position itself. But pretty quickly that became an illusion. It was something used to cater to the engineers that it wanted to hire to feed into their graduate student culture that they wanted to continue on once they got into a workplace, to have a workplace with soft, colourful, bouncy cushions, just like a graduate student lounge.
Right.
And it kept up that illusion as it became a very big and very powerful company. So, of course, I wanted to believe that Google was on the right side, as some smaller Californian companies are, in trying to make the internet a place where the world can speak to itself in a free and humane manner. But Google isn't that anymore, and the trajectory that Google took is much the same as any other large corporation that grows up in the United States. Google, because it involves itself with the world, is, if you like, an exporter, like Coca-Cola is an exporter. And it needed to deal with foreign markets and foreign governments and foreign regulation, but it had no experience in doing that. So it came to hire people that had worked for Hillary and Susan Rice in the State Department. And in that manner, Google and the State Department became reliant on each other.
Do you think that for many of us around the world, those of us who use Google every day, enjoy the Google Doodle, do you think we're being misled? Do you think that we have this sense of this, as you put it, soft and cuddly portal into the world where there's something deeper that we should be worried about at stake?
Google imprints on people's eyeballs billions of times a day that colorful logo, that logo that appears like it was constructed from a child's playroom blocks or from a kindergarten. And, just like the IDF has a history of using innocent-seeming blonde women as spokespersons, or under George W. Bush, the White House spokesperson was similarly a woman, even though the positions taken militarily were aggressive and, if you like, masculine. Google, through this imagery, has been, concealed the proper perception of what it's doing. So let's turn to what it is actually doing. Google's business model is to create free service traps. So that's, for example, store all your email with us for free. Tell us all the things that you're interested in, and we'll search the net for them for free. We'll supply the operating system to your telephone. So most of the smartphones now, more than 80% of those have been sold, actually have the Google operating system inside, and report all your contacts, your GPS location to Google, which it says that it says that it needs to do that in order to show you where you are on a map when you look on your phone, for example. So these free service baits are used to collect billions of pieces of information about individuals each day that they are not giving to other people. They're not even giving them to the National Security Agency, for example. It takes the information, stores it, indexes it, and uses it to create computer models of people's interests. And then using the computer models of people's interests, it sells ads to couple the advertising with those interests. That's 80% of its business model. Now, it does engage in other forms of business. Since 2002, Google has been involved in selling search services at the least to the National Security Agency. The first contracts arose in 2002. It is formally part of the defense industrial base. In fact, in the book, I refer to an email sent between the head of the NSA and Eric Schmidt, and Sergey Brin, the now CEO of Google, talking about how it is part of the defense industrial base. And so that this close connection between Google's business activities, its business model, which it can't get away from, and the US government, created an opportunity for the National Security Agency to stick its fangs into everything that Google was collecting.
Julian, I should note, we requested a comment from Google in response to some of the arguments you make in the book. They replied, but said they didn't have a comment on this at this time. But in 2013, speaking at an event in New York, Eric Schmidt, Google's Eric Schmidt, said there's been spying for years, there's been surveillance for years, and that he was not going to pass judgment on that. It's the nature of our society. What do you make of those comments?
Eric Schmidt had been, he's met with the head of the National Security Agency. Freedom of Information Act's come out in relation to that. He's someone who goes to the White House several times per year. He's been to the last 4 Bilderbergers. This is someone who fits the model of a head of industry player, a classic head of industry player. He engages in the same sort of relationships that you'd expect, say, the head of GE to engage in. And that's very natural because those are the sort of relationships you need to maximize the power position of your company and your other interests. But we should see that Google is a normal, large American company, and it suffers the same problems of integration with the state that other large American companies do. Unlike, say, Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing, however, Google is involved in the business. It is its business model to collect the information on billions of people every day, take that and store it and keep it in U.S. jurisdiction. So that's the real difference. And the perception of what it is not at all like the perception that we've built up.
Sure. In fact, we willingly give our information for the most part. Let me ask you about you and all this. I mean,
we willingly give information, but I don't think that there's proper informed consent in the giving of that information because people don't really understand.
Right.
Yeah. I've spoke to one of my lawyers recently who's not a technical person, doesn't know anything about the internet, and he read the book, and he was very shocked and surprised. And I asked him, well, why? What was the transition in your perception of this company? And he said, I had no perception of this company. I thought it was just like a tap that you turn it on and search results come out.
Yeah, and quite frankly, it's helpful. We use it every day. We didn't, if Google goes down, how do I find out information? I mean, not only do we see it as benign, to a certain extent, we see it as helpful, as assistance.
Giving each of us a competitive edge over the other.
So I've got to ask you about you. You were sharply critical of Google in this book, and of course, you have your critics too. You and WikiLeaks have admirers, but some have accused you of being a criminal and a traitor. It occurs to me you're there in the Ecuadorian embassy. This is quite a bold book to write. How do you feel about being such a divisive figure? Does it bother you? Is being controversial something you're comfortable with?
Well, look, we went head-to-head with the US government. It wasn't our intent. Our intent was just to stick by our agreements with our sources, which is to represent them to the public, a court of public opinion in a fearless manner, and to not censor them in doing that. And of course, we also have an interest in exposing war crimes and these sorts of things. But having gone down that path, of course, it did trigger an enormous reaction from the U.S. State Department and Pentagon, and that reaction is a result of intense embarrassment and loss of perceived authority by those institutions. So they had to, on the one hand, distract from the publications, which were undeniable because they were their own documents or articles based on their own documents, revealing the deaths of more than 20,000 people in Afghanistan on a case-by-case basis, individual deaths, and more than 108,000 in Iraq, and then, of course, U.S. State Department's involvements in many countries and what was happening in Guantanamo Bay and many other issues. So they needed to distract from that. And of course, they used the method, which is, I think, tied, but nonetheless seems to work for them, that they've used since World War II at least, which is whenever there's criticism by national security reporters or publishers of the Pentagon, State Department, and other U.S. security apparatuses, they say, oh, what about the risk of these publications? So to distract from actually talking about the deaths of literally hundreds of thousands of people, they instead try and enter into speculation about speculative harm that might come about as a result of publications.
But when people have opinions about you, you know, you at the center of it, like, does it, I mean, because it goes beyond the State Department at this point. I mean, your WikiLeaks has turned you into something of a celebrity, right? I mean, you're famous or villainous, depending on who one asks. Are you able to brush that off? Do you stress about that? Is it a source of anxiety? How do you feel about being at the center of this, being a focal point?
Well, let me just complete. The U.S. government said last year in the trial of Chelsea Manning, under oath, that they could not find a single person who had been harmed from our publications. And they had really tried because they wanted to use it for the prosecution. So that's where we stand. No organization is perfect who works at scale. The Ford Motor Company is involved in all sorts of deaths. I'm sure it's not with intent. Same with the BBC. Riot started in response to its broadcasts. But thus far, we have the U.S. government saying that they can't find a single person. Now, how does this affect me? Well, you know, it's just part of the nature of things that when you're involved in leading a publisher like I am, that is infuriating big powers, and we get counterattacks. We've had many of those after over 8 years. I'm used to them to a degree. The size of the counterattacks that started in late 2010, well, they pushed the organization right to the very edge. But we have lived through it.
And all of that outweighs what I mean, do you ever feel personally hurt? It's when these things begin, each sort of new attack you can take in a sort of personal manner, but after a while it starts to normalize and it becomes simply, if you like, the profession that you're involved in. And I suppose for someone who isn't, you know, has never been in the media spotlight, what you learn, I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, that if you don't have a really big media concern that can sort of keep control of your image, maybe, for example, Rupert Murdoch has such a concern that can kind of adjust the perception of who he is, although he hasn't done that well, I suppose, in that perception. Your celebrity can get away from you, and in fact does pretty quickly get away from you. That is that the image or the myth that is created by your opponents and the media starts walking off on its own, and you don't feel that you are that person. It's a little bit like a virus. So, you know, perhaps a virus starts out as being chickenpox and it enters into a particular population group, and it starts bouncing around that population group. And individuals in that population, perhaps they're not susceptible to high temperatures, or perhaps their mucous membranes are particularly strong. And as the end result of that virus bouncing around in that population is that it evolves into something that reflects the population that it was moving in. You know, I'll give you another, maybe easier to realize example. Yeah, okay.
The Barack Obama and his birth certificate. Was he really, in fact, born in Kenya? And this birth certificate meme was flowing around, you know, essentially the Tea Party riot, and adapting and changing and shifting. And in the end, reflected the interior psychological and political contours of that population more than it did Barack Obama.
But when you say it's hard, you stop to disconnect from the person that they say that you are. You are a lot of different people depending on who one listens to. You're described as being everything from passionate and funny and courageous to vain and paranoid and manipulative. What do people, in your view, get wrong about you most often?
Well, almost everything. That's the perverse nature of not simply celebrity, but the perverse nature of being famous and having a superpower as an opponent. That's just anyone who's in that situation has the same result. For example, although it would seem a bit indelicate to compare myself to Nelson Mandela, if you look back, before he was a celebrated leader of South Africa, he was on a terrorism list that prevented his entry into the United States until 2008. Margaret Thatcher accused him of being a terrorist. In fact, David Cameron accused him of being a terrible terrorist. Similarly, Carl Bildt, the Swedish Foreign Minister, said that he was a terrorist. And
are you comparing yourself to Mandela?
No, I wouldn't want to because it's indelicate. But at that period, he was demonized as
right.
He was terribly demonized as being a terrorist. Interestingly, because I have studied Mandela a bit, he was captured by the South African authorities. He was on the run, and he was captured by South African authorities after the CIA tipped off the location he was in. So you have incredibly, Barack Obama using Mandela, rushing, in fact, to Nelson Mandela's funeral and heaping Nelson Mandela's body across his back, metaphorically speaking, like a bearskin rug, and showing it off. But in fact, not apologizing for the role that the U.S. government took part in imprisoning him for nearly 30 years.
Julian, at the time of your meeting with those Google executives, with Eric Schmidt and others in 2011, you were under house arrest. You're now living in another type of confinement. That is, for almost 2 years, you've been living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. It's such an interesting paradox. I mean, given that you've built your career on trying to bring freedom to people around the world, what is it like to have your own movements so restricted?
Back in 2010, I made this sort of strategic calculation that we would have to publish, just on principle we'd have to publish, and then we'd have a hard fight, a very hard fight, which we wouldn't necessarily win, but we had a good chance for 5 to 7 years. And I think that is bearing out. There's an increasing realization, even in this country, that what has happened is quite unjust. And it's just the United Kingdom has a lot of prestige in place in the issue, and it also doesn't want to offend the United States, so it needs to find a way to swivel through without losing face over the present diplomatic standoff. But in the beginning of the year, as a result of abuses that took place in my case that were seen in the Supreme Court, and another case, that of Andrew Symeou, the British Parliament changed the law and said that there was to be no more extradition without charge. And I haven't been charged in the United Kingdom or in Sweden, and therefore I should not be extradited. It seems obvious, that it's an absurd situation that you could be extradited without charge or any evidence. And that finally the UK Parliament has agreed. Not I think because it's particularly concerned about what happens to me, but it's very concerned about exactly the same thing happening to other people in this country.
What is it like for you in there? Do you have your own room? Do you get a chance to go outside at all?
Well, outside the embassy there is £7.3 million of surveillance. It's about 12 million American dollars emitted surveillance by the UK government on me in this embassy. That's how much they've spent over 2 years. And when asked for on a Freedom of Information request for the breakdown of that, they refused to give it, citing national security grounds, but we know from our counter intelligence work and by looking at the cost factors that there's approximately 16 people 24 hours a day surveilling this embassy from the British police alone, if you include the managers of the operation as well. So that, that's a difficult circumstance for someone that's running a publishing organization involved in a dozen different legal court cases around the world, most of them involving the United States, to preserve our ability to act. On the other hand, there can be no raids in the middle of the night, no subpoenas, because it is an embassy.
How is your health? There was speculation that you might be leaving the Ecuadorian embassy this summer, and then there were rumors that your health is deteriorating. And I think about your mental health too. When you dedicate this book to your family, what the toll it might be taking to be in that embassy. How would you describe your health these days?
Well, look, I'm pretty hard to kill, and I come from a very long-lived family line, but I am quite adaptable, and to some extent, this business I'm involved in, where you are involved in moving the world small piece by small piece to a state that you find to be more of your liking. And if you can't do that, at least pointing out those people who have brought it into a state of disrepair, that's a very satisfying thing to do. So in some ways, the conflict that has come about as a result is not altogether unwelcome, but it's not something that my children, for example, signed up for. So that's easily the greatest irritation.
You got a pretty logical and dispassionate way of describing all of this. Is that the face you put on during interviews, or are you really able to control your emotions that way?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's just necessary. You'll find that people in conflict situations, especially people who are trained to be in conflict situations or difficult situations, like paramedics, some police, some soldiers, develop an understanding that you have to do what it takes to get through the situation, and therefore you have to be diligent, and you can't let your emotions push you around. And maybe people who have some of that ability are called to those professions, or not at least rebuffed by them. But the situation with my family makes me pretty angry, but anger is also something you can transform into a fuel to get useful work done.
I really appreciate the time you're taking with us today. I've only got one or two more questions to ask. I wanted to say, you're living in the Ecuadorian embassy because you're currently wanted for questioning over claims of sex offenses in Sweden, and you're avoiding extradition. You emphasize that no charges have been laid against you, but you've also said that your biggest fear is that Sweden would then send you to the U.S. and you'd end up facing the death penalty. And surely there are, people listening to this right now who would believe that I'm speaking to a traitor to the United States right now. Is that your biggest challenge, avoiding being sent to the States?
Well, it sounds like you've taken some of your context from the British press, which has a dog in this fight.
Okay.
Let's give the context. The context is as a result of the U.S. has been building profiles on how to destroy us since 2008. In fact, we've published them, secret documents on how to knock out our center of gravity since 2008. Anyway, come to 2010, the U.S. Diplomatic Security Service started investigation into us, and then a grand jury was started up by the DOJ, FBI, and a WikiLeaks war room by the Pentagon with 120 people in it, admitted 120 people working around the clock. That investigation, the DOJ component, has continued and continues to the present day. The DOJ last filed on April this year, April 25, that it was continuing with that investigation and pending prosecution. It's a really big thing. There's lots of countries involved. We've filed criminal cases in various countries in relation to the intelligence activity. The FBI has been stomping around Germany, UK, Denmark, Iceland in relation to that. Now, in June 2012, I formally applied for asylum at the embassy here, the Ecuadorian embassy, in relation to the US case. That was assessed, and a positive asylum decision was given. Under international law, the UK is then meant to permit me to take up my refugee status. That's the law for refugees. Now, a preliminary investigation started in Sweden in August 2010, and then was immediately dropped in relation to two women who went into a Swedish police station to ask for advice about could I be compelled to take an HIV test. This is not in dispute. This is something that is submitted to the Supreme Court, in fact, by the prosecution. The Swedish state then decided to initiate its own criminal investigation into whether I had committed a sex crime, despite the objections of at least one of those women. The senior prosecutor of Stockholm then dropped the whole thing. And in the context of the US attack on us and a national Swedish election in late December 2010, I have nothing to do with Sweden, by the way. I just went there for to give a lecture on Afghanistan. Then resurrected the whole thing, the preliminary investigation, but did not charge me, and then said that it wanted to speak to me, but refused to come to the United Kingdom to do so, or to pick up the telephone, etc., which is perfectly normal in other cases. And that then resulted in a situation where I couldn't leave the United Kingdom for my asylum, and where the British police said that they'll arrest me to extradite me to Sweden. And that is the technical excuse which has now been used to thwart Ecuador's granting of asylum, to obstruct that asylum. Despite that it's very clear under international law that that is not to be done.
That was certainly a clarification. Thank you for that. I'm still wondering about whether the greatest threat is to be extradited to the United States. Is that your top concern?
Well, the British government have said that even if the Swedish government drops its preliminary investigation and ceases to try and extradite me, they're going to arrest me anyway. So yeah, that's been the greatest concern for a long time. But it's also not just me that concern affects. It affects some of our other staff. And Chelsea Manning, the alleged source of the diplomatic cables last year, was sentenced to 35 years in prison.
Yes.
And there's part of that case involved me as well. In fact, on the last day of sentencing, my name was mentioned more than 20 times. So there's a clear U.S. interest in creating a general deterrent, both from the inside in relation to targeting people like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, and on the outside in relation to prosecuting the journalists that seem to be the most involved or most culpable.
Julian, a final question to you. Just listening to you talk and listening to all that all that your life is right now and isn't as well. I mean, in terms of the confinement, for all the fame you've garnered, for the change you've resurrected or created, for the support you've received, and then for all the controversy and the targeting, the confinement, the situation you find yourself in right now in this Ecuadorian embassy, unable to leave. Would you say you're proud of what you've done? Would you trade it in? Has it all been worth it?
I can instantly say I'm proud of it, not because I haven't thought about the issue, but I have thought about the issue. So, yeah, I'm proud that we've set a really important precedent, which I hope will inspire and motivate others, and which has inspired and motivated others, including Edward Snowden.
Thank you for your time today.